Our reading this morning comes from Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt. This is ready. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. That is Exodus chapter 12, verse 34. You'll need to travel light. Take what you can carry, a book, a poem, a battered tin cup, your child strapped to your chest, clutching your necklace in one hot, possessive fist. So the dough isn't ready. So your heart isn't ready. You haven't said goodbye to the places where you hid as a child, to the friends who aren't interested in the journey, to the graves you've tended. But if you wait until you feel fully ready, you may never take the leap at all. And infinity is calling you forth out of this birth canal and into the future's wide expanse. Learn to improvise flat cakes without yeast. Learn to read new alphabets. Wear God like a cloak and stride forth with confidence. You won't know where you're going, but you have the words of our sages, the songs of our mothers, the inspiration wrapped in your kneading bowl. Trust that what you carry will sustain you and take the first step out the door. You must keep this practice forever as a statute for yourselves and your descendants. Thus, when you have entered the land which the Lord will give you as he promised, you must observe this rite. When your children ask you, "What does this rite of yours mean?" you will reply, "It is the Passover sacrifice for the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt. When he struck down the Egyptians, he delivered our houses." The most important thing to know about Passover is that it is a ritual that Jews share every year as a reminder about resisting empire and oppression and the power of community. Each year, the Seder is celebrated among family and friends. The story is told and the foods are shared, and it is done as if for the first time, not as history, but as if those gathered made the journey themselves. The Passover Seder is a ritual of food, story, song, and invitation. It's a commandment to relive this time of their history. As Lauren Davidson writes in a piece in The Atlantic, the Seder is not just a retelling of the story, like the weekly Torah readings in synagogue. It's an invitation for Jews to relive the liberation from slavery as if they had actually been there in Egypt, to teach the narrative to the next generation, and to claim the history of their people as part of their own individual identities. The power of keeping this commandment allows individuals and groups to explore nuances in meaning, to make new connections, and experience other unexpected gifts. This happens both by exploring new frames and storytellings, but also by the ways we each change and grow over time. The story itself is a liberation story for the Israelites. Having once been honored guests in the land of Egypt, over time the Israelites have become slaves. A new Pharaoh has come to power at the beginning of the book of Exodus and gives an order. As Cole Arthur Riley writes in her book, This Here Flesh, of the many unsung heroines of the Bible, I am drawn to the story of Shiphrah and Puah. They were Hebrew midwives whom Pharaoh ordered to kill every male Hebrew baby at birth. In holy defiance, they delivered every child safely. And when confronted by their tyrant, they looked him in the eye and lied to his face. Hebrew women are strong, they told him. They give birth before we can get to them. Their rebellion is a model for our liberation today. Perhaps to fear God is to refuse to submit to the demagogues of this world, to refuse to grant them the power they crave, and to place our waiting in the hand of God, who won't manipulate and wield our fears against us, but will hold them in tenderness. By such an act, Moses is one of those boys who is saved, placed in a basket, and sent down the river by his mother, rescued by the Pharaoh's own daughter, and raised as her son. Passover was actually the beginning of the Jewish New Year for some time, a creation story of sorts, and the story of liberation of the Israelites from Egypt, the story of a nation led to freedom and reborn. Before the liberation, though, is the story of what makes the Exodus possible and necessary. The traditional story goes, called by God to lead his people to freedom, Moses is sent to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. They had been enslaved for 430 years, doing back-breaking labor and subjected to torturous conditions and merciless death. God has heard the cries of their people and tells Moses that they will deliver them from the Egyptians. God tells Moses to assemble the elders and tell them that they will be freed, and to go to Pharaoh and say that the Israelites are to be freed. If Pharaoh does not comply, 10 plagues will be sent to the lands of Egypt, each in an effort to convince Pharaoh to free the Israelites. Each plague was worse than the last and continued through all 10 until Pharaoh all but chases the Israelites out. The plagues begin with water turning to blood, killing all the fish in the river. The plagues that follow are frogs, lice, wild animals, diseased livestock, boils, a thunderstorm of hail and fire, locusts, darkness for 3 days, and lastly, the death of all firstborn beings in Egypt, humans and animals. The name Passover comes from God telling Moses that the Israelites should mark above their doors with a sacrificial sheep or goat's blood to indicate that those were the homes of the Israelites and therefore were to be passed over in the last plague, sparing the lives of their firstborns. I was recently listening to an On Being podcast where Krista Tippett interviews Dr. Aviva Zornberg, a scholar of the Midrash, the commentaries of rabbis wrestling with scripture. She notes early on in the episode that the Hebrew title for the book of Exodus is Names. An interesting choice, she says, as names are mostly only offered in the beginning of the book and then kind of mostly disappear. Zornberg and others have suggested that this is a way of expressing that the Israelites have lost their sense of identity, becoming somewhat anonymous, a particular layer of this due to having become slaves. And they possibly have reached some level of assimilation, despite having become slaves. So this marking above the doors is not just a way to say, save this house, but also an act of both separation and self-identification or distinction, of claiming or reclaiming their identity, but for good, as opposed to their identity having been designated as enslaved people. All the homes that participate are Israelite and the people with whom God will renew their covenant. In order to be freed, they must claim their identity. Of course, these have been a people who have lost hope after such prolonged enslavement. Even Moses, blessed Moses, argues with God for days about not being the right person to lead his people from Egypt. And not only does Moses say that he's not the right man for the job, he's not convinced that the people would believe him if he were. They'd become resigned, defeated, had given up, surrendered, one might say, to their status, their role in Egyptian society. Moses couldn't imagine what he might say that would inspire his people to take the many risks that would be required to leave. Angela Davis said, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time." These words might well have been laughed at by the Israelites in Egypt. For them, no change would be coming. And yet, Moses tells them God has promised their freedom with very specific but entirely manageable instructions. The question for all of them becomes, what are you willing to sacrifice? It might strike us as an odd question. They're enslaved people, after all. Haven't they sacrificed enough? But perhaps they haven't. Are they willing to sacrifice their resignation? How far are they willing to go for their and our liberation? Will they fear the unknown that would come with their liberation or slavery in Egypt? Or slavery in Egypt more? Were they willing to sacrifice their complacency, the comfort of the familiar, to be free? And what if Moses is wrong and God doesn't lead them to safety? They don't know this God, and if they are not freed by the morning, they have announced to all of Egypt that they had planned to rebel. Who would risk that backlash? Maybe it would make more sense to lose a child and hide behind their door and continue living, if it could be called that, as they had for generations. Who knows if they had even thought to wander further beyond mourning. Although Moses is promised that he will lead his people to freedom, do they know that there is no promise that the way will be smooth or fast? They were not prepared. Turns out the road to liberation is a long and difficult one, requiring more sacrifices. And sometimes we don't know where we're going. God does keep their promise to their people and leads them across the land until they reach the sea. They panic at this obstacle, as now they also know that the Egyptians have again changed their minds and are following behind. Maybe they should have stayed enslaved. Why didn't they think? Why did they think? Why did they think that they could leave? Life wasn't that bad before. And then the sea is parted and the people make their way across just as the last person steps onto dry land, the sea crashes back down, drowning the Egyptians who had attempted to follow. They have made it. God has led them to safety. The question quickly becomes, but how will we eat? They're in a desert and moving around. They're not foragers, if there had even been enough to forage. Again, the idea of slavery seems appealing. The sameness, predictability, life laid out for them all fairly neatly. It is a constant fight to get them to be willing to leave that behind when all they have now is even greater uncertainty. How many of you have wondered if it was or is really worth fighting? How do we know? When do we give up our resignation, complacency, our "that's just the way it is" view? If we know it will take 40 years just to find our footing again, will we commit to doing it or just say, "Nah, I'm good"? Because this is the ultimate marathon, the kind that lasts for generations. Israelites were leaving all the time, some heading back to Egypt, some probably lost to the wilderness. Seeing no light at the end of the tunnel, they were all too willing to return to enslavement because it was what they knew. Though the words are attributed falsely to Harriet Tubman, I suspect Moses was out there saying something like, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. The Israelites believed they were marking their doors for freedom, but they were also marking their doors for a journey. They were warned to eat in haste, to be dressed for travel, with sandals on their feet and a stick in hand. But in many ways, they were not prepared for how long the journey would be. Would they have risked so much if they had known? While for years the Egyptians had marked the Israelites as slaves, the Israelites chose to mark themselves for liberation. We see many marks for things in the world: bumper stickers, election signs, billboards, ads, you know. Many of them name choices for a different world than the ones that we dream of. We liberals in Florida and America have been marked as snowflakes, whiny babies, and many things I probably can't repeat. We are very much a minority here, just about everywhere in the state, and certainly across the state as a whole. And still, we mark our doors, claiming them for liberation. We do this with our pride flags. Sally and Liz have bought a new, more inclusive pride flag to hang in the sanctuary that perhaps they will show you during the reflections on the sermon or later on. We do it with our Black Lives Matter banners, our commitments to accessibility and to the environment. We do it with tattoos, protest signs, showing up at pride events, and more. We do this with our shared new UU values of justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity, all founded on a liberating love. How will you mark your doors as we face the wrath of Pharaoh? How will we mark our church? I have long been living into my own philosophy that everything is political, not Democrat versus Republican, but political in the ways that everything in our lives has been made political. I don't pass up opportunities to wear t-shirts that make statements about my own values and find other ways to express what is important to me. Otherwise, it is entirely possible that it will be assumed that I am just part of the loud voices, that I am anonymous, assimilated into the dominant culture. I refuse to be viewed that way. This is a conversation and idea that both congregations are struggling with right now. How visible should you be? How are you being marked, or will you mark yourselves and your doors for justice? How would you grapple with both things, being marked and marking, being true at once? These are not questions that I can answer for you, but that you must answer for yourselves, among yourselves. All I can say for sure is that our faith calls us to live into a liberating love, one that seeks for freedom for us all, recognizing that none of us are free until we are all free. In this time when our democratic institutions are being stolen from us, do we risk marking ourselves for liberation as the Israelites did, even when we have no assurance that we will be freed come morning? What does love call us to do? May we do that. Keep choosing the love that holds us all and will lead us yet to the promised land.